Hello, and welcome to the ThreeWill podcast. This is your host, Danny Ryan. I have Kirk Leimohn here with me. Hello, Kirk.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Awesome. Thank you for joining me. We've got Kirk working on a white paper for us. And as part of, he's been a member of a team on some complex SharePoint migrations. And as part of that, we wanted him to sort of put together what are sort of 10 points that we think people need to know about complex SharePoint migrations. And so you've put together the first two. I know you've got an outline of the whole thing,
That's
the whole
right.
kit and caboodle, but today what we're going to do is we're just going to focus in on two aspects, not necessarily the most important, but they're important.
Right.
Let's talk about two of the aspects that you wanted to highlight first.
Okay.
The first one, I hear this all the time with migrations, which is communication.
That's right. Yeah.
Communication. So you started off with that one, so it must be at least somewhat important.
It's on the top of my mind. So I think there's several aspects to it. There's what are you going to communicate and to whom, and then there's when are you going to communicate it.
Okay.
So from the what standpoint, for larger migrations, say if you're migrating a large number of site collections, the IT organization isn't going to be able to handle everything themselves.
Okay.
So they're going to delegate to site owners or others for some of those potentially. So if that's the case, then you're going to have to give some documentation and guidance to those site owners. So that's part of the communication.
So your first part of this is breaking off and delegating some of that to the individual site owners so that they're able to assist with the migration as well.
Right, and they're aware of it, right? So they're the ones that are going to be affected. So if your migration is going to, you're going to change your feature set during your migration. Maybe you're going from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint online. That's a fairly common one. If you're doing that, well, certain things aren't there in SharePoint Online. You can't have farm solutions, and there can be some difficulties in the migration where certain things don't go over well. So, you can't migrate to running workflows to SharePoint Online. So you can communicate that through various means, but so if you're going to let site owners know this, you might want to create a policy document, and in that policy document, it might say what's covered in the migration, but more importantly, what's not covered in the migration. So that might be, as I mentioned, running workflows. It might be a good example if you're going to SharePoint Online. So that's one way. So then there's other things like we have a runbook, which might be a checklist of what a site owner would do before and after the migration.
Okay.
So they might prepare their site for that migration. So if you're going to SharePoint Online or you're going to a different SharePoint environment where your list view threshold is now going to be smaller, well, then it was in your current environment, and then you're going to have to deal with that, and maybe the site owners have to put indexes on some of those lists.
Okay.
So you could help those site owners out by telling them, hey, you've got some large lists out there, but you may want them to put the indexes on themselves.
Is that runbook? Is it like a document, or is it a task list, or what is it?
It's both. It's a document that's a checklist, basically.
Okay.
And you can have a runbook for the team that's doing the migration themselves, but you may want to have a runbook for the site owners that says, here's what I need to do before and after my site or sites are migrated.
Okay. And then I guess at a higher level, so this is part of getting ready for the migration and communicating, delegating out some of that communication. And is there typically like a SharePoint site that's created for communication purposes to everyone? So that's
one way. I mean, you need to have, if you're doing a large migration where there's a lot of site collections involved or a lot of things involved, then you need, each. For example, if you're doing thousands of site collections and each of those has one or more site owners, you got to have some database to kind of say who the site owners are. Have we communicated with them yet? Has the migration started yet? Those types of things. So We have used SharePoint lists for that.
Yeah, that sounds like a good.
You could use a database for that as well,
or an Excel spreadsheet.
You could, yes, you could. I mean, especially if it's shared, and probably put in SharePoint or something. You don't want to email it around.
Oh, come on!
But you need to have a way to communicate when you've got all that information. It's got to be, you got to have some electronic single point of reference for that. So, and that would be we kind of keep track of that. There's also things like maybe your support staff is going to need a document to kind of how they're going to manage certain types of issues that you expect to occur.
Because they might be the site owners will hear about it, but then support will also hear about it once you move over to the new site as well, and issues with the new site. Yeah,
or there could be a self-help or other type of document that end users could use for common situations that you want to kind of head off so that support isn't overwhelmed with issues. So.
Very nice.
So that's a lot of the what that's involved out there. Certainly there's more, but you've got to get buy-in from your executive or your the company that's make sure that they support your effort. And they understand kind of what you're not supporting when you're doing this effort, because if you're moving to a different environment where certain things aren't supported, then there's going to be people that are not happy that they're losing, say, hey, we've got this solution that's a farm solution and we need it. Well, either it's not migrating or it's going to have to be re-architected. And so you need support from throughout the company that's going to say, yes, this is the direction we're going. And then you also need to communicate early enough so that those site owners can take steps to correct what has to be corrected. So in some cases, it may be re-architecting an application that's written on a farm solution, for example.
And so a lot of this, you're communicating out because you're about to move somebody's cheese, and people inherently don't like change, right?
Right.
So there's some people who will be unhappy regardless of what how well it goes. And so I think a part of reason why you're communicating is to mitigate some of the things that could that could upset people, or because you're letting them know. I think a part of this is in the migration itself. Okay, here's the because there's sort of this uncertainty about when this is going to happen, what changes are going to happen when it does happen, and how do you communicate out to the world that, hey, we're going to do this. Here's when it's going to happen. There's also, I think, I often hear on migration projects, sort of, when is the cutover happen? Like when we off the old site and onto the new site, and what happens if changes on the old site? How have we dealt with things like that?
Yeah, well, from a communication standpoint, you definitely want to plan for that. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. So for some sites, you can cut it over immediately and the old site is gone, or it's not accessible in general, and you've moved it over and they're ready to go, and you can do that on an evening or a weekend, and you can basically try and ensure that they're not using it at that time. But for larger sites, it can take longer to go over. It may take days for the content to get over there. And it kind of depends on the method you're using, whether you're doing like database copies or what have you. But the client-side object model is going to be slower to move, and if you're using Azure Upload services, that can help. But the Azure Upload API. But so then with those, you've got incrementals, and you've got to communicate that. They need to know what the cutover is. So you can have emails that kind of help communicate that. You can have banners that are put on the source and or target sites that help communicate that, and you want to time all that based on when is the most appropriate timing. So for example, you may want to send an email out to site owners 2 weeks before their site is going to be moved over. You've already sent them one well before. It says, here's the schedule. Maybe interact with them on the schedule, because some are going to need to change the schedule because their very important month of the year is right around Labor Day or right around Christmas or whatever it is.
Yeah, this is a finance site. You do not want to do this at the end of the month.
You don't do it on, this is a tax site. You don't do it in April.
Sure.
Those types of things. Yeah. But then after you've kind of ironed out the schedule, you want to send a reminder, probably maybe a week or two before you're going to do it, said, hey, it's about to go. Maybe send an email right when it's going, or maybe you just update a banner on the site, and then you can use emails and banners from there if you like. And you can automate that or not, depending on the number you've got. We have automated in the past for large number of site collections.
So for number 2, because I know you've got to run off here.
Yeah.
I think it's closely related to communication, which has to do with expectation, which is pilots and running pilots, and sort of I think that our philosophy definitely on seems like it translates over from app dev over to migrations, which is get those early cycles in so you're learning together, and so pilots become very important. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the big takeaways I would say on pilots is have your pilot process try and cover as much, if not all, of your migration process that you can.
Okay.
So it obviously is going to cover the physical moving of bits from your source environment to the target environment. You're gonna try and test several sites, site collections, what have you, and hopefully a varied number and different in type. Maybe some departmental sites, maybe some that have applications, maybe some in different regions of the world.
Okay.
Some of different sizes, large and small. But not only the content, but you also want to cover your other aspects, the communication. So you're sending out those emails involving the support process in your pilot. So make sure that support is ready. Tickets. How our support ticket's going to be generated, and are you all ready for that? Other things like issue remediation. So you might have a feedback loop of issues that are found, and you want that feedback loop to work, and you've got a triage process that you need to make sure you vet, whether it's manual or automated, and all of that should be part of the pilot process. And then of course you can have 1 or 2 or even more pilots if you want to. Each of those is a big feedback loop into how you're doing the whole migration, so that once you get to what I would call production migration, then the spigots are on full potentially, and you don't want to have to be catching up on, our process isn't ready for this. You want to vet out as much as you can in the pilot before you go fast in production. Now you may decide to go slow in production, and that would help.
Okay.
But a lot of times they're like, no, we need to get this done by a certain date. And once we start, we got to really move, and so that's why the pilot process is important.
How is it decided sort of who goes into the pilot?
That's a great question. I think that's going to depend on any client of ours, any company out there. You want, in an ideal scenario, you want, as I said, a breadth of different sites. So that's one thing. You want to, before you get too deep, you need to catalog things, and that's you need to catalog what you're moving. You need to understand what you're moving to an extent, and then maybe the IT organization that's responsible for the migration would start picking what makes sense. But they also have to reach out to the site owners, those responsible for those sites that's being moved or copied. And they have to work with them and say, can you be part of the pilot? We want, and a lot of times you're going to get better hand holding when you're part of the pilot. So that's the pro for them. The con is they're gonna there's gonna be some tweaks in our process that we're gonna learn throughout this, and we want you to be reasonable and flexible with us as we go through this. So you want to find those people that you can work with for the pilot.
And you probably also want to get input from them as well, as far as what you could improve in the whole thing.
Of course.
As well. So
yes. Yeah.
Nice. What else about pilots? Anything else you'd like to point out?
I think that's mainly it. You want to just cover you want to cover the entire process. So if you're just covering the moving of the bits or the copying of the bits or the reorganization of those bits, that's an important aspect. But you've got to cover communications, as we've already talked a lot about communications. You've got to cover your support processes, where your documentation is and everything. Is it working well? And then how you're remediating issues, and the triage process, and just how that feedback loop works.
For pilots, is it something that you do a certain number of sites for the pilot, but then when you do the production one, you redo those sites, or do they move over at that point in time? What's typical for that?
It could be either.
Okay.
And it's, I think, depending, I think I like pilots that are somewhat large, so you have a good, you aren't just doing a small handful of sites. Now you can start out that way, and you're going to do that. If you're doing automation, you're going to be doing some testing of some sites, and those might be throwaway. You're not going to, you're not basically going to keep them in the target environment. You're going to redo them later. But if you're starting to do a large number, it's kind of a shame to have to redo them later. So you would want to work with your site owners and give them the expectation that we are going to move over if everything's ready for it, and that way you don't have to redo them. But then there's, in this case, this site didn't go over well, and we found out a way to correct this in the future. But for you, it's too difficult for us to kind of fix it in the target environment. We would rather copy it over again. Are you okay with that? Yeah. And so that would be one of the hiccups you'd have to get around. But so I think it depends. But if you have the luxury to redo them, maybe that's nice. But if you're doing a lot of pilot sites, I think you're going to want to keep them over there.
This was great. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know a lot of the stuff you pick up on projects, just to be able to communicate this out to folks and sort of summarize it is really helpful. I know for us, when we're just talking about complex migrations, I know we're involved in like Jive, so migrations from other platforms to SharePoint. You've been involved in one that's SharePoint dedicated to multi-tenant, right?
Yeah.
So that's a complex migration, and I think there's a lot of other sort of areas where I think a lot of what you're sharing here definitely pertain to those as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to summarize all of this. So those are the first two,
right? Yeah.
And you've got more upcoming, and I look forward to chatting with you about those.
Okay.
And if you're folks who are listening to this, if you're about to embark on a complex SharePoint migration and want to chit chat with us about it, please reach out to us through ThreeWill.com, and we'll follow up with you and look forward to talking to you about what you're trying to do. Thanks again, Kirk, for taking the time to do this.
You're welcome.
Everybody have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.